Good morning, everyone, dear colleagues and friends here in D4 and at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences in Zagreb. And I see some attendees also online. Welcome to, I think this is the sixth workshop within the project on the cartography of the political novel in Europe, and the second one that we are hosting here in Zagreb, of course, with the title The Political Novel Through the Lens of Gender. Uh, I have, I think, too many times repeated the same speech every time at the beginning of our conferences and workshops, so I will not repeat the whole thing about the project. But I would also like to announce that we are having and organizing the second annual conference on the political novel at the University of Brighton in September. And then we have also this year another workshop, the 7th, I think, organized by the colleagues from University of Nicosia. It is the end of October. And we have some colleagues here who are participating in this workshop. So instead of tiring you in the morning with everything about the project, you can follow us on our social media. There is also a website, caponeu.eu, where you can follow all the information and program and everything that we are currently doing. The platform is in the process of development, so I think in fall we will have the first maps and everything. So by the end of project, we hope to have 400 to 500 text portraits of the most representative novels, political novels in Europe. We hope to have other material as well. So we are filming this workshop, and it would be streamed. It is streamed on our social media, and the recording will be available for those who are not able to attend today. I would also like to thank our colleagues from Zagreb, Mirela Dakić and Professor Nena Divić, whose idea was to organize the workshop on the problem of gender. So the whole idea and the description of the call for papers and everything was written, designed by them. So thank you both. And I would like to thank also Tatiana Tihomirovic, our project administrator, who took care of everything else. So, okay, and now I'm extremely glad to have to present you our first keynote speaker, Professor Jasmina Lukić, who is well known in these parts of Europe, but I will just, for those who are not familiar with her work, say a few words. She's a professor of gender studies at the Central European University in Vienna, previously in Budapest. She is also a principal investigator in one Horizon Europe Maria Sklodowska-Curie Action doctoral network, European Literatures and Gender in Transnational Perspective, and I think it is still going on until 2026, yes? So, so you know what is to be me with all the responsibilities, administrative and everything. But it is also a pleasure to do something, especially for our literary discipline, which usually is not so recognized as a discipline that can be endorsed in such a way. But Professor Lukić is also the coordinator, which is also interesting for our project in the CEU of GEMA, which is Erasmus Mundus MA program in Women and Gender Studies. I think it was the first one that was established. I read somewhere online. And she is also, I will just mention a few publications for those who are not familiar, co-editor of Times of Mobility, Literature and Gender in Translation, which was published in 2019, and also Women and Citizenship in Central and Eastern Europe in 2006, and also known in our parts as the author of Drugo lice, prilozi čitanju novih srpskog pesništva, which is a monograph on the contemporary Serbian poetry, and my favorite, the book on Borislav Pekić, Metaproza, čitanje žanra. Borislav Pekić will be also our author who will be presented in the Cartography of Political Novel, I think at least with 2 or 3 titles. So yes. Okay. Please, the floor is yours. We decided not to interrupt our speakers, but to shorten the discussion if needed. So you can all relax if you have few minutes more to speak. We will be very patient and try to keep the schedule on by shortening the discussion. And since this is a workshop and we will spend 2 days together, we can discuss over a glass of wine or something in a more relaxed environment. So there is no pressure, and we can start.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. And before I say anything else, I want to thank really warmly to the organizers of this event for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. Particular thanks to Mirela, who initiated my joining this group. For me, this is a particularly important, significant, and special experience because Zagreb is a part of my life. And in speaking about transnational literature, I'll be talking about myself as a transnational scholar. So it's not by chance that I am using this topic. As you know, I am going to talk about transnational literature and the feminist politics of reading. And actually, I would like to try to talk to you about this complicated relation between various poetics and the ways in which I would like to try to argue here transnational literature turns out to be political per se, in a sense, in a way that we are defining transnational literature at the current moment. And when I'm speaking about it, I'll try to offer some definitions. But I want from the beginning to say that I'm talking about a particular body of literature which is being written after 1970s and in a particular context with particular traits. So it is not any kind of transnationalism. It is a body of literature which is connected with the processes of globalization and the changes in the world we live in. So let me start. I'm going to start with a quote. No writer walking down these godforsaken streets can be immune to the political fabric that surrounds her like a muggy spider web. The world breeds politics, eats politics, dedicates to politics. The trick is to avoid writing directly about politics while not losing contact, still being profoundly politically aware. It involves a kind of Zen and the art of archery of language. You shoot the arrow of language without burdening it with a message. And if it is a good arrow, if the shot is correctly aimed, it will hit its political mark and mark that even the writer might not be aware of when she starts its shoot, when she begins to write. This quote is from Luisa Valenzuela, an Argentinian writer, and it's taken from the volume Writers in Politics, in which a number of contemporary and very relevant contemporary writers were talking about their relationship with the politics and political and how they see their writing. And interestingly enough, Valenzuela speaks about, retells an anecdote from her youth when in her house, actually, Jorge Luis Borges and Ernesto Sabato were having debates about how to understand what's essential for literature. Should it be literature for art for art's sake, or should it be something she calls committed literature? Let me give you one more quote. Long before I even dreamed of writing, of becoming a writer, I was faced with the false idea that there was an option, a dichotomy, a pair of mutually excluding opposites. It was during the Jorge Luis Borges Ernesto Sabato debate, very intense in the literary Buenos Aires of the early 1950s, when the intelligentsia banded together as a protection against Juan Perón's persecution. Both great writers would frequent my maternal home, not necessarily at the same time, and the ongoing discussion seemed to be a matter of life and death. Should we be for Borges's art for art's sake or for Sabato's committed literature? I would listen attentively to both arguments and believe more in the art for art's sake. It sounded better to a very young adolescent, nobler, and nobler in that you were not imposing your ideology on others, or that what would you do? What do many writers? I made the title, that's beautiful. Your message. The debate that Valenzuela describes here, with her early inclinations towards pure art, must sound very familiar to many in our parts of the world. Until 30 years ago or so, it was art for art's sake and deep belief in autonomy of literature that was not only one of the theoretical strongholds for my generation, but also one of the most powerful tools to defend the sphere of literature from forceful and damaging of politics. Obviously, a political tool, since the two positions cannot be fully separated, while the actual meaning is very much contextual. Valenzuela herself were to come to the same conclusion. And for her, and as she claims for many other Latin American writers, it was the Cuban Revolution and the political events from the 1960s that prompted an understanding that there is no real dichotomy between the two positions. Thus, merging between the two positions became for her the essence of the new Latin American novel. And as the first quote here points quite clearly, for Valenzuela, political aspect in writing is related to language, which has the power to unmask oppression. And this is a point in which, for Valenzuela, feminism steps in. I admire the women's movement for having made us aware of the oppressive possibilities of language, she says. In this very system of oppression that she focuses in her writing, aiming to make visible that which state apparatuses want to remain invisible or forgotten. For her, it opens the question of memory, coming back to the role of formalism in Yugoslav criticism from the 1970s, 80s, before the breakup of the country. It's very interesting to look back and see how actually we deeply believed in the autonomy of arts. But looking back, I see how deeply political it was, not only in a way that it defended us, as I say here, from intrusion of the politics, but it was also creating the space where political role of literature became possible. I think a history of what considered to be subversive at that time and was acceptable in the realm of literature due to this defense that literature is autonomous would be an interesting alternative history of culture and socialism. Valenzuela's understanding of political in literature is close to Stuart a Scheingold's understanding of modern political novel. For him, political novels in the 20th century, or as he calls them, the novels of political estrangement, are also struggling with the question how to bring together political issues and the questions of literary value. This new type of political novel shifts attention from political across and institutions to the general public, ordinary people whose agency has been appropriated by autocratic regimes, by bureaucratic institutions, and by professionals with the expertise to colonize consciousness. Furthermore, these novels raise questions about political legitimacy and the social, cultural, and economic foundations of the state, and are widely recognized literary merit, the literary immigration at its best. They draw on cultural narratives to capture the zeitgeist of the terrible 20th century, and I'm emphasizing this point in Scheingold's approach. You will see later why, as it has been experienced by those robbed of agency by the institutions and ethos of hegemonic modernism. I would like to underline here the question of agency, since it will come back in the context of feminist theory as one of the key points of an intervention that transnational feminism wants to make. Just a second. I have to find me this. So here is the quote. I was kidding you, but there will not be too many of them. So Scheingold's understanding of political novel is based upon his understanding of modernity and the profound feeling of betrayal of its promise of political agency. Karen Ear, on the other hand, contests revival of political novel, which she calls geopolitical novel, in American literature of the 21st century, with both postmodernism and postcolonialism. She focuses on several novels written mostly by migrant women authors, mostly third generation of those outside their nation. So not the third generation of migrants who moved from home, but those who moved to the States and then start writing about that experience. Their use of national allegory is devoid from exilic longing or nostalgia that characterizes earlier migrant writings. They discuss national within a larger global context and point towards political questions that move past nationalism and into the terrain of the world system, as she puts it. Her understanding of geopolitical novel relates to processes of globalization and is characterized by the shift from national to global perspective. Focus on the political, or rather social commitment with an emphasis on post-national, post-colonial literature is also present in Peng Chea's characterization of world literature. I am proposing here a normative conception of world literature as literature of the world, double genitive. This refers to imagining and stories of what it means to be a part of the world that tracks and accounts for contemporary globalization and earlier historical narratives of world. Such imaginings are often informed by concept of the world from non-Western traditions, both pre-colonial and post-colonial. Such a literature is also one that seeks to be disseminated, read, and received around the world so as to change it and the lives of peoples within it. And that's something that I want to underline here, giving the explicit role to literature to change the lives of people who live in the world. More important, because he points to the opening of other worlds, such a literature is also a real and ongoing process of the world, the principle of change immanent to the world. In Chea's view, the power to be critical, or to put it in Sabatos and Valenzuela's words, committed, is particularly present in post-colonial literature, which became world literature by virtue of its participation in worlding processes And the last formulation is, in a similar way, Jebani Ganguly and other theorists of world literature speaks of a particular form of social engagement as one of the key characteristics of the new genre that she indicatively names world novel. Her interpretation evokes Scheingold's argument on disillusionment with modernism's engagement and democracy, only put in a more recent context. Thus, she relates the appearance of world novel with the crack in the liberal consensus that began to be visible in spring 1968, and as she puts it, grew exponentially until 1989. And it is very interesting that Ganguly puts forward 1989 as the year which is key information of the world novel as the new genre in contemporary literature, emphasizing that she does not think of the fall of the Berlin Wall, which of course she doesn't say that, but it is a part of decolonizing Europe processes of showing that it's not so important what happened there. There were so many other worldwide important events, which she is listing, which are actually marking 1981 as the year in global history. But what she is pointing at is our excesses in a neoliberal world order, which started to be felt earlier than that year, but became quite visible in year 1989. It is a period in which the genre of the world novel comes to stage to offer a critical perspective on these events. Those are works that, quote, express a new kind of humanitarian ethics, a new internationalism built on shared dread of human capacity for evil, coupled with deep awareness of the ambiguities of sharing grief across large expanses of ravaged death. The topic of humanitarianism is also one of the topics which is so often related with discussion of global literature, globalization, world literature, any attempt to actually think about the literature speaking about the world we are living in. And it also comes in literature speaking about not only transnational literature, but transnational feminism. And I will refer to that a bit later. In both cases, for Che and for Ganguly, political aspect of literature is an inherent quality of the text and its relation to the world as a textual primary reference and a particular kind of literary chronotop is something which is simply implied. This generalized perspective brought into discussion one more novelistic genre, that of a global novel, argued for by Adam Kirsch, which is also related to the category of world literature and closely connected to the processes of globalization. Kirsch understands global novel not as a genre, but rather as a perspective that governs the interpretation of experience. It allows for writers of the 21st century to address a particular form of cosmopolitanism, the globality of human lives today. Kirsch sees the global novel as a form which allows for rethinking of the sense of humanity in this new context, which is in itself a critical claim. On the background of these globalized perspectives of world literature, I would like to introduce another concept where the connections between literary and political get to be constitutive of the term itself. It is the concept of transnational literature, which has appeared on the wave of interest in border studies in the 1990s to come into focus in the early 2000s. As Paul J. puts it, like any category that seems to name a kind of literature, transnational literature is in fact a fluid or somewhat arbitrary category of intersection between historical change, literary writing, and academic study. It has emerged in recent decades as a kind of catch-all term for literature with some kind of global scope that defied categorization with regards to its national origin and has been born out of the convergence of specific historical developments over the course of the 20th and 21st century. I started by saying that transnational literature is a kind of distinct body, rather distinct body of text. In a sense, I'm contradicting myself by putting this quote of Paul J. here. But what I want to say is that there is not one definition of transnational literature nor one approach to transnational literature. Yet it refers to a set of characteristics that allow us to think about one author as a transnational author or a piece of writing as a transnational piece of writing. And the line of argument I'm going to put here will be referring to a set of concepts that we need to actually think about what is transnational and what is transnational literature and how to approach it, about the set of concepts that necessarily come in if we are thinking transnationalism from the perspective of the end of 20th and the beginning of 21st century. The first study which introduces the concept of transnational literature was Azadeh Seyhan's book, Writing Outside the Nation from 2001. She speaks about the new culture of transnational, bilingual, and multilingual literature that has arisen with multiple migration waves that occurred in the last century. The scope and intensity of these migrations led to the widespread feeling of the loss of stable communities and to new geographies that defy national antinomies and fortified borders. This is a situation that calls for new critical language which could offer an explanation for these transfigurations. A part of these new processes is the creation of a new body of literature which does not fit into the current division between national literature and strong literary figures who are writing outside the nation. You might say that things changed, but just look at and you know that the national literature as a dominant category of analysis has lost a lot of its power. Just look at the ways how curricula are still organized. And a very simple example, look at the European literary prizes. They are given by a national. There is no literary prize which is organized in another way or thinking Europeanist in another way. Following Arjuna Padurai's use of the term transnational, Seyhan underlines the significance of diasporic or exilic quality in this literature. In her understanding, it is literature created by those who live in between languages and cultures. I understand transnational literature as a genre of writing that operates outside the national canon, addresses issues facing territorialized cultures, and speaks for those in what I call paranational communities and alliances. In her view, the question of language is a key point of difference between transnational literature and post-colonial literature. Since their migration is not necessarily a result of colonial relations, diasporic writers and their compatriots do not share with their host that kind of historical, cultural, and linguistic intimacy, however problematic, that exists between the colonizer and the colonized. This is a much bigger question than this quote is indicated here, and I don't intend to open it up. And I am setting this kind of wider context because it is impossible to think about transnational literature without setting the frame in between national and world literature, where transnational is stepping in, or I think should be stepping in again, as a space for critically thinking what gets lost in both dominating paradigms. The national literature is totalizing in one way, but the global perspective and the concept of world literature is totalizing in another way. So transnational literature, which appeared in the early 2000s on the wave of border studies, was for a period of time very popular concept, and then somehow got lost with the rise of the concept of world literature. But it is my claim and the claim of the whole project we are having that we need to bring back transnational literature as a part of this conceptual framework in order to be able to address all those phenomena which get lost in these totalizing practices. Paul J., on the other hand, in 2001, summed up his understanding of transnational literature in the following way. Transnational literature is a particular type of literature, emergent at an unidentifiable historical moment, and dealing collectively with an identifiable, historical moment, and dealing collectively with a set of issues and themes associated with the colonization, globalization, postmodernity, and technology. Put another way, transnational literature is about the variety of forms of transnational experience produced by the convergence of these. This quote is important because when it comes to transnational literature, we have the similar debate which was happening, if you remember, when postmodern literature came with self-reflexivity as one of its main characteristics, and metafiction having self-reflexivity as one of its main characteristics. And then a counter argument to defining metafiction and postmodern literature in that way was, yeah, but we had always self-reflexivity as something which is a part of literature and history. It's not only self-reflexivity in any possible way. And in this sense, we have the same debate about transnational literature, that literature has been in some way transnational forever. But this is a particular form of transnationalism, and that is why I'm putting emphasis here on the cluster of concepts, and we are going now in that direction. I hope I'm not taking too much time. There is still some, but not too much to go through. So that's why I think this quote is very important, because it is pointing to this particular historically identifiable moment in which the new type of transnational literature is coming to the stage, and we need to think about it as a particular category. According to Paul J., these four sets of themes provide transnational literature with a kind of thematic coherence. Engaged as it is with the exploring, engaged as it is with exploring the social, political, cultural, economic, and social forces associated with imperialism, colonialism, decolonialism, globalization, etc. I'm cutting through. It engages with the broad range of issues and subjects: migration, displacement, exile, the fluidity of borders, both literal and figural, cultural hybridity, identity and citizenship, status of refugees, which have become pressing in our time. I intentionally put on these concepts back into your view. Among numerous approaches of the questions of transnationalism in literature, I would also like to mention here only one more, that of Françoise Lyonnais and Shumei Shi, who introduced the concept of minor transnationalism in an edited volume with the same name. Lyonnais and Shumei Shi brought together the concept of Deleuze and Guattari's concept. They used the Deleuze and Guattari's concept of minor literature and put it in transnational perspective. Minor transnationalism produces networks of minoritized cultures and various forms of cultural transversalism. Here again, this claim speaks to Paul J., to what Paul J. said, and I'm quoting from Lyonnais and Shumei Shi. The cultural transversalism also produces new forms of identification that negotiate with national, ethnic, and cultural boundaries, allowing for the emergence of the minor inherent complexity and multiplicity. New requirements of ethics become urgent, and expressions of alliance are found in unexpected and sometimes surprising places. New literacies are created in non-standard languages, tonalities, and rhythms, and the co-presence of colonial, post-colonial, and neo-colonial spaces fundamentally blurs the temporal sequence of this moment. At this point, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the themes Paul J. puts forward here are at the same time the key concepts of the several interrelated research fields that frame not only thinking about literature, but create a new interdisciplinary paradigm. It is indicative that Dato Quaison and Girish Daswani, in their introduction to Companion to Diaspora and Transnationalism, come to a similar conclusion. For them, transnationalism and diaspora are two key concepts by which to organize our understanding of nation, identity, and globalization in today's world. As they put it, taken together, the concepts of diaspora and transnationalism promise a broad understanding of all the forces and the implications that derive from the vast movements of populations, ideas, and technologies, images, and financial networks that have come to shape the world we live in today. The similar attitude and actually following Quaison and Daswani, Pauline Uvakwe, analyzing new women writers from Africa, transnational women writers from Africa, puts emphasis in the same set of concepts. And I'm going to now try to cut down a little bit, but the point here is that we have to approach this field in an intersectional way and in an interdisciplinary way. And we, in all cases, speak about number of concepts which come together as a conceptual cluster. If you remember Nike Ball's analysis of traveling concepts, then what's important for me here is her emphasis that no concept works alone, that concepts work in clusters. And here we have a cluster of concepts which continually comes back when we're talking about transnationalism and transnational literature, which somehow put emphasis on not only identity, but lived experience, and bring back lived experience as something which is a part of thinking about transnationalism. And it will bring back the ways we are dealing with the experience in literature within this question, how we talk about political and art for art's sake coming together in this literature. So all these concepts speak about the way we are being in the world and are profoundly related to the questions of power and agency. If we agree that it would be impossible to think transnationally and to read transnational literature without employing these conceptual clusters, then it becomes clear that the gender and queer perspective need to be an inherent part of any possible theory of transnational literature. Bringing gender and queer perspective necessarily complicates the initial dualism of the debate we have started from. Rather, it proves that it is impossible to make such, to argue for such a dualism. And Valenzuela, in her text, later says that her life work at the moment is fighting any kind of dualism. As any form of feminist literary criticism or queer literary criticism has shown, its commitment to social and political ideas about the world and the way we as human beings should be allowed to live in it are at the core of any theory addressing gender and sexuality issues. And I want to remind you here of the article of Elizabeth Ross, Feminism After Death of Durocher, where she's analyzing various theoretical options how to declare a text to be a feminist text, to conclude that actually that is not a stable quality of the text, that it is how the text functions in society and how it is being read and how it how it engages in opposing patriarchy that defines its quality of a feminist text. It is working with this conceptual cluster brings us here to, and feminist, falling upon feminist theory brings us to another question, and that is how this whole conceptual turn, if we are talking about the new paradigm, is speaking to transnational feminism. And I want to bring here the definition of Sylvia Schulter-Mandel, which is in a way defining the position from which I would like to speak here. Presently and historically, transnational feminism thus always refer to the question of cultural difference as one which generates new and ever more sensibility feminist scholars. As Karen Kaplan proposes, transnational feminist theory must articulate difference in power and location as accurately as possible. It must also find intersections and common ground, but they will not be necessarily comfortable. By bringing transnational feminism here into discussion, I am actually bringing another sphere in which is debatable and where we cannot easily use the terms without clarifying where we are standing. Transnational feminism, like any feminism in principle, has many forms and many possible positions. And what I'm talking about here is transnational feminism, which is not going after seeking unity and consensuses, but the transnational feminism, which is speaking about differences and going after recognition of what has been lost, forgotten, or suppressed. We have an example in the work of Crystal Tariq, who is speaking about the direct relations between transnational feminism and American transnational literature, where she's saying that on the basis of the legacy of the American work of the American feminists of color, transnational feminism, which goes in that direction, speaking of power relations and what has been suppressed through the existing system of power. She speaks about particular American context, but goes beyond that. It is transnational feminism which allows for literary criticism to recognize new values and to oppose the existing canon. So it is actually, again, about how we read the concept and how we speak about the agency, about the way how transnational feminism brings in the concepts of agency, of solidarity, and the ethical questions. And what I want to argue next in this context is that actually the question of transnational literature and the question of political dimension of transnational literature in this perspective of the debate between political and art for art's sake positions clearly show that it is the connection between ethics and aesthetics, transnational ethics and transnational aesthetics that come together if we want to talk transnationalism in this context. I would like to refer here to work of Anne-Marie Fallon in an interesting small book, which is called Transnational Trousseau, where she's looking into the way how the topic of, legacy of the book of Robinson Crusoe is traveling through different cultures, where she is pointing that the specific transnational aesthetics can be related to the concept of uncanny, or as she puts it, unheimlich, and that what defines transnational literary aesthetics is a way of seeing both place and placelessness together, a way of reading the world to understand the cultural logic which create and maintain the unheimlich in world of cultural difference and introduction. I'm coming to a close. I'm sorry it was too long. I thought I had shorter than my time. But I have one more example here. I'll cut the last one. But one more example, which is important here, and which speaks about really literary criticism and interpretation in gender perspective, is taken from Susan Stanford Friedman and her reading of transnational literature on the background of transnational feminism. Susan Friedman is an author who is known for a number of interventions in literary field, her readings of modernism in particular, but she also engaged a lot with the global literature, world literature, and transnational literature, and in particular into questions of transculturation. One of her essays in which she is defining her position towards transnational literature is also an essay in which she is claiming, putting forward the concept of locational feminism. And it's also interesting that against the background of a couple of decades in which it was almost impossible to say word feminism in singular, but it was always, we were always very careful to speak about the feminisms. She declared that she's going to use the term feminism because the way she thinks about feminism is that it's not one phenomena, that actually feminist agenda is not born in one place and then dispersed around the globe, but that it is actually being born in various places, in that there are various locational forms. And let me give a quote here which speaks about it. At metacritical level, the geopolitical rhetoric on feminism, as I have defined it, operates according to a transnational grammar with a number of specific figural formations. I will briefly discuss and illustrate some of the most prevalent forms, namely metaphorics of nation, borders, migration, location, and conjunction. Geopolitical and transnational literacy for feminists begins, I suggest, in recognizing these 5 tropical patterns. By putting forward these 5 tropical patterns, Susan Friedman is actually giving us a method of feminist reading in transnational perspective. And she shows that in her essay, Reading a Number of Texts. At the same time, she claims that related ideas are the ideas that concern patriarchy and resistance to patriarchy are originating in various places, and they are not something that comes one from the other. She says the notion that the given social order privileges the masculine does not, I believe, have a single origin, nor does the advocacy of gender inequity. Rather, these constitutive components of locational feminism have emerged differently in particular times and places and have traveled from one culture to another, producing hybridic cultural formations of indigenous feminism influenced by other traveling forms of feminism. It is yet another form to say there is no original culture. So actually there is no original feminism, but one feminism means multiplicity in this case. And this multiplicity we can read if we get some kind of transnational literacy, looking at the way, and I want to repeat these 5 concepts: nation, borders, migration, location, and conjuncture are being addressed in various texts which we read from feminist perspective, and then we will see whether we want to read them as feminist texts or not, how they find. And jumping over to the final point, which will take just a minute, I want to finish by reminding us of the author that you all know too well, but just with some quotes which concern transnational literature. And that is a quote from Dubravka Božić as somebody who speaks about transnational literature. I actually want to remind you that she was a very strong proponent of transnational literature. And in a way, in a number of her essays, she was calling for critics to rethink the existing literary theory and find the space and the new terms and the new concepts for this literature, which is written outside the nation. She knew Azadeh Seyhan's book. She appreciated that book very much and took on the form being outside the nation as something where she is placing herself when she writes on zone. This is the essay on zone is her authorial statement in favor of transnational literature. And there she describes implications of a choice to live in on zone, outside nation zone. On zones are many and transformative, but I'll stop with interpretation and for the end just give you one small quote from her. The fact that I would always be an outsider in a national, but also in any bigger game. Above all, because I am a woman writer working in a small language and coming from a part of the world where literature and culture were never priority. Do I complain because of such major handicaps? Perhaps. But as an outsider, I was free to shape my own literary taste, to pick my own literary traditions, to build my own system of literary values. I was free to discharge expectations and fully aware that I would not be at the center of things or quickly canonized. So there was nothing to worry about. In other words, it is the loneliness, this is not Dubravka anymore, of literary life without the context, the force of wisdom, choice. That's it. I'm sorry, it was longer than I thought. And two sentences of the Utopia research project, this doctoral network research project that has 12 PhD students, 11 PhDs. But the most important, it will try to produce a handbook in transnational women's literature. And that's what we are working on. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. We are going further. My name is Marina Protarka-Štimec from Zagreb. And I'm pleased to announce our next speaker, our dear colleague, Polina Mackay, a professor of literature from University of Nicosia. She is working on the themes including gender, sexuality, feminism, literature, activism, and most recently, the medical and the health issues, especially in medical political novels and illness narratives. Today, we will talk about gender at the medical political novel. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you see me? Because I'm quite short, so I think I'm sorry about that. So if you can't see me, just tell me, and I'll go a bit like this. So if you can't hear me, just wave. As you can see, I've discovered the presentations that Marco created on the SharePoint. So I'm using these everywhere I go. I really like the design, so I hope you like it too. So thank you very much for including me in this workshop. I'm very excited to be here. It's my first time in Zagreb, so I'm looking forward to what's coming next as well. And hopefully you'll enjoy hearing me speak about the medical political novel and gender. The idea I'm going to put forward today is there is a type of political novel that we can usefully label the medical political novel. And very briefly, this kind of narrative uses disease as a metaphor for social problems with the intention to challenge the politics, the histories, the structures, or the socioeconomic conditions that drive these issues. While the aim does not always appear to be the achievement of social change, often the stories, characters, and themes of these books explore the possibilities and limitations of new ways of living. Well-known examples of this kind of narrative include Albert Camus' The Plague, José Saramago's Blindness, or Emily Mandel's Station 11. I have them all in a slide here. All three novels show how sociopolitical structures are tested and often found wanting in the face of devastating epidemics, revealing fundamental flaws in the varied responses of governments and individuals to crisis. The covers of the books that I'm showing you on this slide speak to the disorientation mass disease can bring to societies. The cover of Blindness, for example, signifies unknowingness by alluding to the phrase, the blind leading the blind. The cover of Station 11 places a deer in an urban environment, suggesting not just confusion, but also erosion of boundaries. The cover of the Greek translation of The Plague, which translates to Ipanukla, which is such an ugly word as far as I'm concerned. The third cover on the slide reflects social breakdown brought by pestilence, manifested in the human figures that seem to be in the process of changing into something less human. In my talk today, I will concentrate on novels by women that fit the category of the medical political novel. I will explore the ways in which they make gender relevant to the aims and objectives of this type of narrative. My major examples today will be Natasha Brown's Assembly and Jacqueline Roy's The Fat Lady Sings, which I have a slide here, and you can see a brief summary books. Both novels arguably write about illness through the lens of intersectionality, offering counter-narratives to discrimination and marginalization, particularly in the context of healthcare. But before the analysis, I'd like to say a little bit more about the medical political narrative as a distinct type of writing. The narrative that concentrates on the political dimension of such things as illness, plagues, or sick bodies and societies is, of course, not a new type of writing. In the category of the novel alone, there are countless examples. In addition to the novels I already mentioned, we can put in this category a few classics, such as Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, which is an account of a survivor of the bubonic plague, with emphasis on the experience of the poor and disadvantaged. The novels by Camus, Saramago, and Mandel are like Defoe in that they're all allegorical accounts of the degradation of individuals and communities by structures of power during times of crisis. I think our aircon is not on, but no, is it? Can we have it on? Yeah, please. Thank you. Says the person who comes from Cyprus, who's always in an air-conditioned space. If you can, that would be brilliant. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption. Thank you. I have to speak louder. In addition to the novel, the short story also lends itself as a genre that can deal with disease and its effects on individuals and society in a way that is relatable and compelling. Given the genre's tendency to concentrate on a single story or plot, short stories can put across a particular idea effectively, a useful trait in political fiction. A good example is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. The story, which lays bare the impact of social expectations on a woman's mental breakdown, shows how her illness was both influenced and exacerbated by the pressures on women and the gender roles they were supposed to play at the time. The connection between illness and political thinking is also prevalent in poetry. As poetry is a literary genre that tries to compress complicated ideas to short forms, it also has an advantage over prose when it comes to tackling political issues concisely. It is no surprise then that much of the contemporary poetry that explores illness and politics addresses inequities in healthcare head-on. The poem that Maya Angelou read at Bill Clinton's first inauguration, for example, brings to the spotlight disparities in health, among other social problems, and uses the occasion to call for action and unity in the nation. Speaking in the voice of a polluted river, Maya Angelou tells us, "Your armed struggles for profit have left collars of waste upon my shore, currents of debris upon my breast. Yet today I call you to my riverside. Here on the pulse of this new day, you may have the grace to look up and out and into your sister's eyes and into your brother's face, your country, and say simply, very simply, with hope, good morning." Here, Maya Angelou creates empathy for our polluted rivers by telling the story from their perspective. She illuminates the responsibility of a society driven by profit for the degradation of the environment. The poem also brings attention to the impact of the climate emergency on communities, and recognizing the interconnectedness of well-being and environmental health, calls for a collective awakening and hope for a society that recognizes and rectifies these injustices. In other words, the poem uses the figure of the sick river to raise awareness about environmental issues and to call for political change, an apt message at the inauguration of a president. What happens after that inauguration? We're not going to talk about that. This was Clinton. Collectively, the examples I summarized here, from novels to short stories and poems, illustrate that the political dimension of health is a primary concern of writing about illness. The argument that I would like to advance here is that there is a category of political novel by women which depicts gender as informed by the wider politics of health. These novels illustrate the complex effects of predominantly patriarchal structures of power, and particularly intersectionality, on the sense of self-belonging and community. As I mentioned earlier, two excellent examples of this kind of writing are two recent novels by Black British female authors, is Natasha Brown's Assembly and Jacqueline Roy's The Fat Lady Sings. Some of you heard me talk about Assembly a few months ago at the project's first conference in Berlin. I also wrote the text portrait for the book, which you can access on the Caponeo website if you want to know more about the novel in the context of the project. As you may recall, my reading of Assembly concentrated on the protagonist's refusal to receive treatment for cancer. I argued that the novel reads cancer as a metaphor for all of society's malignancies, principally racism, white privilege, colonialism, and sexism. I concluded by suggesting that the protagonist's rejection of treatment for cancer is a rejection of an entire system of assimilation of marginalized communities, and particularly women, into intersectional structures. Roy's The Fat Lady Sings shares significant similarities with Assembly. Both novels explore themes of identity, race, and mental health through the experiences of Black women in contemporary Britain. Both present the internal struggles and social pressures their protagonists face, focusing on issues of systemic racism and sexism. The narrative styles of both books are introspective, as the narrators are also the protagonists of the books. This style gives us nuanced insights into the characters' thoughts and emotions. Additionally, both authors use these characters' stories to critique social structures and challenge readers to confront uncomfortable truths about privilege and discrimination. A major difference between the two novels lies in their narrative scope and setting. The Fat Lady Sings is set in a psychiatric hospital in London and is mainly concerned with the psychological and emotional journeys of its two main characters, who are two women of color named Gloria and Merle. In this sense, it makes available a more intimate and confined exploration of mental health and interpersonal relationships. In contrast, Assembly has a broader scope, following its unnamed protagonist through different aspects of her professional and personal life in the UK as she moves in various social contexts, including the finance industry in London, private hospitals, and the country estate of a privileged white family. As the story unfolds in these diverse but obviously connected spaces, the book manages to place systemic racism and sexism in a wider, more expansive context. The narrative of The Fat Lady Sings unfolds through alternating vignettes, each told from the perspective of the two women. Gloria is a middle-aged queer woman who is struggling with grief after the passing of her long-term partner. Merle, a much younger woman, is also dealing with grief and trauma. Both are vulnerable in different ways, thrown into an oppressive healthcare system that medicalizes every aspect of their lives, ignoring their other complex needs and wants. While they're not the only inmates of the facility to receive inadequate and unsympathetic treatment at the hands of a crumbling social care system, the narrative shows how the women's mental health crisis is made worse by the fact that no effort is made to show them that they belong. Gloria's narrative often points out the link between the sense of displacement she feels and the intersecting prejudices suffered by Black women in healthcare settings. Talking of a nurse's bad behavior towards her, for example, Gloria notes that his aggression comes from the fact that he sees her outbursts as simply, quote, a black thing, a savage thing, I see it in his eyes. All the time they just keep on provoking us. Then when we strike back, it proves all the prejudice they carry in their hearts. Quote. These comments suggest that the novel reads mental distress at this point as the manifestation of the effects of the complex politics of prejudice and systemic failures, which disproportionately affect minority groups and especially women. In this context, the novel's ending, which shows Gloria standing in front of her house, singing as loudly as she can, and the other narrator, Merle, taking control of where she goes next, not only alludes to the silencing suffered by women of color, but also to the potential freeing of these voices in Black women's writing. The novels like The Fat Lady Sings and Assembly depict disease and its effects as central to intersectional politics. They illustrate that political novels, with a focus on illness, provide a good framework for further analysis of the politics of health. In such a context, Gloria's singing at the end is not just a gesture towards the new possibilities extended to Black female writers in Britain as the field expands and as publishing becomes more inclusive. Rather, from a health humanities perspective, the voice can be read as a reversal of what Miranda Fricker calls epistemic injustice. This concept consists of two kinds of infringement, which are relevant to the experience of prejudice, but also to the experience of illness: testimonial injustice and hermeneutic injustice. Fricker frames her analysis as follows, quote, testimonial injustice occurs when prejudice causes a hearer to give a deflated level of credibility to a speaker's word. Hermeneutical injustice occurs at a prior stage when a gap in collective interpretive resources puts someone at an unfair advantage when it comes to making sense of their social experiences. An example of the first might be that the police do not believe you because you're Black. An example of the second might be that you suffer sexual harassment in a culture that still lacks that critical concept. It's not hard to see why this idea can also be useful in understanding the experience of illness. As Javi Carrel has argued in the Phenomenology of Illness, those who are ill are particularly vulnerable to epistemic injustice. Testimonial injustice can and does occur when sick persons are presumed to suffer from diminished cognitive functions or from unstable emotions due to their illness. Consequently, patients' testimonies about what is happening to their bodies may be disbelieved or dismissed by others. Hermeneutic injustice happens when sick people have difficulty understanding and communicating their experience due to a lack in existing resources. If we see the ending of Roy's novel through the lens of epistemic injustice in healthcare, then the novel becomes a good example of a medical narrative that shifts this paradigm. When Roy has one of the narrators sing at the end of a narrative that laid bare the ways in which two mentally ill patients have had their truths and experiences diminished, both by individuals and by an entire system, she reverses the main elements of epistemic injustice. Here, her protagonist articulates her truth, and we believe her because it was laid out for us to see throughout the narrative. As readers, we're given the resources, the novel we are holding in our hands, to understand this character's situation and others like her. Like the protagonist of Assembly who refuses treatment for cancer, the narrators of The Fat Lady Sings refuse assimilation into medicalized and institutionalized structures of mental healing. Gloria, in Roy's novel, prefers singing to sessions with the psychiatrist at the facility. The unnamed narrator of Assembly chooses to disengage from the medical context altogether. In this sense, these medical political novels can be usefully described as narratives of Black feminist refusal, which has been defined as Black writers' refusal to sell themselves short, refuse institutionally imposed intellectual trajectories. Black feminist philosophers like Alisa Biera, Lindsay Stewart, and Christy Dodson talk about refusal as a form of critique, with the potential to propel Black feminism towards new territory. A central strand of their critique relates to the idea of reclaiming the Black pained body, upon which much of colonialism has depended. Black pained body is an important figure in the Black critical imaginary, for as Saidiya Hartman has argued in her analysis of Black female slaves, quote, the material relations of sexuality and reproduction define Black women's historical experiences as laborers and shaped the character of their refusal of and resistance to slavery, end quote. The reproductive capability of female slaves drove the labor market, while their disruption of this production through abortions, infanticides, or suicide wrote the narrative of resistance. In this context, it is the enslaved female body, rather than culture or gender, that provides the primary narrative of the story of slavery, as well as the principal site of Black refusal. Assembly and Fat Lady Sings share many similarities with the narratives of Black refusal these feminists are talking about. As we have seen, their protagonists refuse to be assimilated into intersectional structures of power, particularly those that police women and their bodies, such as healthcare. Writing by Black women, as demonstrated in the examples of Natasha Brown and Jacqueline Roy, brings a unique and necessary perspective to the medical political narrative. These novels not only highlight the marginalization of women, especially women of color, within healthcare systems, but also challenge the norms and institutional practices that perpetuate these injustices. Through their characters' experiences and acts of refusal to enter the medical structures that underpin inequity, these novels reveal the potential of this genre to serve as a powerful tool for social critique and change. By giving voice to marginalized experiences and challenging epistemic injustices, these works contribute to a broader understanding of identity and health. In so doing, they affirm or reaffirm the importance of literature and literary analysis in the pursuit of social justice. Thank you.
Well, our next speaker is coming. It's our dear colleague, Eric Bergman, I'm happy to say, our new American-Finnish transfer to Caponeu Zagreb team. And he is a literary scholar working in the field of narrative theory, especially developing the concept of nepantla, as theorized by Gloria Anzaldúa. And his themes, his work, his previous works are on race, narratology, critical theory, and now today also in queer theory. So he will present his paper titled The Layered Narrative Technique of Pajtim Statovci's My Cat, Yugoslavia, and Resulting Queer, Feminist, and Migrational Interventions. So please.
Thank you, Marina. And thank you to the organizers. It's great to be here. And a big thanks to Zrinka Božić, who's made it possible for me to be on Caponeu. And I am hugely indebted to you, Zrinka. Thank you very much. Yeah, so here's kind of an outline of what I'll be talking about today. Should stay within 20 minutes. And this is the novel written in Finnish, Yugoslavia. And it was published in 2014, 10 years ago, and 3 years after that in English. It won a prestigious literary prize and was made into a play and staged at the National Theatre in Helsinki. And I lived in Helsinki at that period, and you saw it everywhere. It was a huge deal, like really visible. And actually, speaking of transnationalism, there's a paper by Hanna Nisila, I think it is, or a chapter in a book, and she talks about how this novel is transnational literature. And this is seen as a huge victory in Finland because it's not immigrant literature anymore. It's and so I thought that resembled Professor Lukić's talk. And so what people talk about when they talk about this novel can be discerned from a radio program on YLE, the national broadcaster, from 2017, with literary scholar Olli Löytty and literature blogger Koko Hubara, and interviewed by Nadia Nowak. In short, what stood out about the novel for these commentators was the depiction of the immigrant experience in Finland vis-a-vis the majority culture Finns and Finnish society and culture. For majority culture readers such as Löytty and Hubara, the novel provided profound insight into what it is like to live as an immigrant in Finland, as well as identifying as a sexual minority and the role of being a woman. In short, the novel, in the words of Hubara, provides an intersectionalist perspective on contemporary life in Finland for the protagonist. And I'll note that that's the third time in 3 talks that intersectionalism has been mentioned. Following the definition of the political novel by Zrinka Božić of, here's YLE. It's our welfare state broadcaster, which I translated into English. My Cat Yugoslavia talks about and deals with the politics of immigration and race and racism in Finland, in line with intersectionalism, with that which is overtly talked about is also influenced, sometimes in very heavy ways, or very heavily, by that which is not talked about. Excuse me. I think gender, especially in this novel written by a man, is a case in point. This talk concentrates on gender in the novel. I had so many things to talk about. I was like, but I had to concentrate. 20 minutes, here we go. Which is central, though not as widely acknowledged as migration in the novel. My main point here rests on the novel's formal structure, namely that it has two narrators, Bekim and Emine, and it's Emine in the novel, not Emina. I'm not sure why, but anyway, mother and son. I argue that how gender is read in Bekim's sections is influenced by gender in Emine's sections and vice versa. This gendered back and forth, in turn, influences how we read the politics of immigration, race, and racism, as well as time, place, sexuality, and much more. I argue that the representation of gender is at once more insidious in its effects and easier to miss in its representation than race, etc. And it is precisely the layered narrator technique that brings about insights into gender in the novel. I further argue that My Cat Yugoslavia is a political novel in terms of immigrant experiences. However, it is, and I made this up, inadvertent political novel in terms of gender. You'll see what I mean in the course of this talk. And as a quick aside, I am new to this project. So when I initially thought all kinds of, everything is political, this is political, all these novels are political. But then Mirella was so kind to send me Zrinka's definition of the political novel. And now I'm not really sure if this is a political novel or not. But when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade, et cetera, et cetera. So I posed the question, if the thematic quality of the political wrangling surrounding a war equals a political novel par excellence, is the inadvertent representation of gender inequality in the patriarchy so prevalent so as to make it almost invisible, not also the stuff of the political novel, the kind of absence of seeing? Strictly speaking, perhaps not, but that's something to think about. The structure of the novel can be taken not only as polyphony and representing heteroglossia, a bunch of terms, but also as one narrator's discourse is read as paired to the other as dialogic and double-voiced discourse. This means that whatever meanings we discern here are dynamic and based on the interaction of the two narrators, I mean. The subjectivity of the speaker is taken together with the context of the uttered language, and the context is the pairing with the other narrator. He who implements this formal structure, which by its very artificiality forces dialogical interpretation and meaning, is the implied author. I'll return to this idea in a moment. I'll add here that this diversity of voices, which is heteroglossia, is, according to Bakhtin, a defining characteristic of the novel, of course. Politically, these two perspectives offer us insights into gender in Finnish and Yugoslavian societies. The fact that literary scholar Löytty and literature blogger Hubara do not make a big deal about this formal characteristic of having two narrators in My Cat Yugoslavia illustrates that this kind of multitude of voices is taken for granted in novels. For me, this formal element begs the question, what meaning, let's see, what meaning is produced by having two narrators? And if Hogan is correct that sex is the foundational categorical identity by which other identities are modeled, including non-sexual identities such as race and ethnicity, then what does it mean that one narrator is a man and the other is a woman? But first, by way of illustrating what I'm talking about in terms of gender, I'd like to shortly compare Statovci's narrator technique to that of Costa Rican-born Mexican singer Chavela Vargas, who was popular in the Spanish-speaking world from the 1950s onward. And I wanted to ask, who here knows Chavela Vargas? So yeah, in Mexico, huge deal. Spain, apparently quite a huge deal. No? Okay, there we go. I encourage us all to return to our hotel rooms tonight, put on Chavela Vargas, and weep desperately. Beautiful stuff. Anyway, Vargas appropriated macho rancheras to sing of her desire of females openly and publicly, to refusing to change the pronouns in love songs written by men from she to he. She was the sidekick of the notorious singer-songwriter Jose Alfredo Jimenez, a hard-drinking and womanizing musician wildly popular for his melodramatic songs of lost love, pathos, and desire. As a matter of fact, one could often find them together in the cantinas, and Chavela Vargas wore chorro trousers and drank at the same pace as Jose Alfredo Jimenez, which, of course, caused problems, but not normal at the time for a woman. Besides desire, Vargas also at times sings with a rage so out of place for a woman at that time based on normative gender roles, and of course made famous by Jimenez with male rage in mind, that masculinity itself is put under the magnifying glass. In No Volveré, you see the lyrics behind me. I won't read them out, and for the sake of time, she sings this among other lyrics. So this lyric reverberates with melodramatic and perhaps self-destructive agency. The entire song is about the decision to not come back, to leave forever. When sung by a man, it's about self-pity and hurt feelings. The poor guy's advances have been thwarted, and he feels really awful about it. But when sung by a woman in the context of a society brimming with domestic violence and nowadays record levels of feminicide, this decision to leave, dramatically and wholly based on one's own decision, feelings, and agency, the entire social structure is put into question. A man can leave, of course, and often does, so why cannot a woman? Vargas appropriates this right by singing a song and simply switching the gender of the narrator. These same kinds of processes, you all know this, but here it is, apply to the novel My Cat to Yugoslavia in a number of ways. If we revisit the concept of the implied author, Wayne Booth, James Phelan, and others, we can distinguish elements of maleness in Emine's discourse, specifically erotic queer discourse, much as with Vargas singing macho songs. I'll give examples of this soon, but first I must discuss time. The reading, of course, is a linear process, and sentences are made up of words in an order, and one section comes after another section. So when we read My Cat Yugoslavia, it opens with an internet chat homosexual hookup, so a fling so squarely based on sex that it taps into our social imaginaries preconceived ideas of men predominantly interested in sex and homosexual men as promiscuous. These are stereotypes, of course, overly simplified generalizations based on sex and sexual categories. And Löytö and Hubara, from the YLE radio broadcast, admitted that they were confounded by the novel's opening episode, and they read the novel a second time and they skipped it. Weird. Skip it. All right, so following Catherine Romagnolo, the beginning of anything, but specifically a novel, is crucial. Quote, beginnings invoke the power of authority, authorship, and tradition, end quote, which Romagnolo says are the same ideas that nationalism and racism rely on. Beginnings call into being the subject positions of the reader vis-a-vis the writer and produce what Susan Lancer calls, quote, a discursive authority, end quote, which is the positioning of the text's various levels, including the narrators, as having, quote, intellectual credibility, ideological validity, and aesthetic value, end quote. In other words, Statovci hasn't begun the novel with internet-age sex just for the fun of it, even though it probably was really fun. I didn't have that written, I just, sorry. Okay, linearity is the key here. Statovci is claiming an authority to evoke queerness, homosexual sex, and the narrator's positioning as a queer man. Everything that follows is hence read through this value claim. We read about the hookup, and then the narrator switches from Bekim to Emine, his mother, and naturally, so does the narrator's gender. However, the fact that the narrator has changed is not made categorically clear until many pages later. Unaware readers are in fact reading the story of a girl in 1970s Yugoslavia from a queer perspective. And even when it becomes clear that a female is now narrating the story, descriptions of men's masculine backs, their handsome symmetrical faces, their buttocks, carry with them the echoes of the preliminary homosexual sex scene from Bekim's perspective. So herein, we can feel the presence of the implied author, who is in fact a queer male writing the narration of a young female living in Yugoslavia. This illustrates the usefulness of the implied author concept because we need not rely on the historical author Statovci, but rather this authorial position is inferred by the reader based on the text itself. So I take the representation of gendered norms for Emine, the mother, the woman, as a critique of the position of women and hence a call for emancipation. This is laudable, while from a feminist perspective, the representation is rather of a letdown. After many, many years in beatings and subjugation, Emine manages to leave her husband, who goes back to Kosovo to die. When the children call Emine on the phone, however, after this happens, but before the husband dies, which happens rarely, it is their father they ask about. He is the vibrant and desired, yet violent and eventually absent center of the family. His being matters. He has heft and authority, even if that authority is based on physical strength and violence. But insight into Emine's life remains flat, and her agency more of a whimper than a yelp. Of course, this may be Emine's personal case. Her defense mechanism might be a kind of spiritual sedation. Statovci's decision to represent Emine in this way is not necessarily an endorsement of Emine's state. However, when it comes to Beckham's subversion of gendered norms, which is to say he behaves in so-called feminine ways despite being a male, the results are depression, loneliness, emotional abuse, and chaos. These states are described much more vividly. Beckham behaves a lot like his mother in domestic affairs and also suffers at the hands of an abusive romantic partner, yet his narrative perspective gives us much more insight into his emotional state, processes, and evolution. It could be that he is another kind of narrator, or as I think is the case, this gives us another insight into the implied author. Men have agency, vibrancy, can suffer in profound ways, while women, by and large, do not and cannot, at least in a text written by this particular implied author. I'll very shortly illustrate this dynamic as how it compares between narrators. Beckham meets a humanoid cat at a gay bar and falls for him romantically. However, the cat is a real jerk. He's homophobic, hates immigrants, and for example, upon meeting Beckham, tells him, and here's the quote, "a frightful name." He continued, "utterly dreadful, ha ha," laughed the cat. "Beckham, it's such a dreadful name, I'm sure I never want to hear it again." This is the way he speaks to Beckham, on and on. The cat is a disgusting figure, and in my reading represents the Freudian id of the Finnish majority culture. There he is. But there's no time to get into that now, although that is something to explore, and I'll explore it later. Suffice it to say that it comes across as anomalous that Beckham invites the cat to live with him. They share a bed. Beckham feeds the cat, washes and irons his clothes, keeps the apartment spotless, not a speck of dust anywhere. All the while the cat heaps insult upon Beckham. The parallels to Emine's story are clear. She too waits hand and foot on Bayram, her husband, who comes from a region in Kosovo that is, quote, renowned for its traditional ways, its violent men, and unhappy women. And one thing that I didn't work into this, but this sentence comes before she gets married and before we know that he's an awful man. So the Emine is narrating this, but she doesn't give away the fact what's going to happen later. She's still hopeful that her future husband's going to be great, but this whole region is famous for violent men and unhappy women. But it's the Finnish cat, in all his nasty and very recognizable attitudes, for a Finn anyway, that gives majority culture Finnish readers pause and discomfort, as iterated by Löytty and Huvara. The fact that it's a cat is an ironic distancing technique. "Don't worry, my delicate Finnish readers," Statovci seems to be saying with a wink and a smile. "It's only a cat." It is astonishing that Beckham continues to serve and be subservient to put up with such a cat. Beckham is a man and can, in the words of the song, leave and not return. Emine does not have that option, or she doesn't feel that she has that option based on the fact that she is a woman. Hence, these similar situations have two very different emotional contexts for readers based on the gender of the victim. Put another way, while Beckham is living in a state of in-betweenness, which is to say behaving in a feminine role despite being a male, he is in a state of chaos and lacks meaning in his life. For Emine, the opposite is true. She too well understands where she belongs, which is in the role of a woman, and it's a renowned fact that women are unhappy and men are violent. Here we go. There's Gloria. As a short digression, this has a lot to do with the concept of Nepantla, which is the central concept in my dissertation. It's Aztec metaphysics developed by Gloria Anzaldúa, but I don't have time to get into that now. But I'm sure if you stick around, or if I stick around, you'll hear about it. Beckham, at the end of the novel, steps into his role as a masculine man through a violent act and achieves a kind of epiphany and clarity. He has accepted his inheritance in the patriarchy and finally kills off the tormenting spirits of in-betweenness. Emine also steps into agency, leaves her husband. She moves into a safe house, gets an apartment, finds a job at a supermarket, and makes a majority culture Finnish friend at work, which in the Finnish context is actually heroic to make a Finnish friend. And that's kind of a joke, but it's also kind of true. It's she makes a friend, this majority culture Finn, and everyone's like, yes, that's difficult. But again, the ending of the novel differs based on the gender of the two narrators. Emine's departure from her husband takes courage. She is leaving behind everything she has ever known, but it is depicted as happening quietly. The narrator, Emine, does not afford us much insight into her emotional state, processes, and evolution. In Finland, women leave men all the time. Emine is now comfortable enough in Finland as a Finn to leave her husband based on societal factors such as laws and the existence of safe houses. Perhaps it is not Emine leaving her husband, but the welfare state taking her away from an abusive husband. Beckham's departure from his in-between identity and his ritual initiation into the patriarchy, into categorical manhood, happens via the violent act and gives clarity. It is squarely his heroic deed that propels him into a new state of being. It is, in short, masculine and falls into the archetypical category of the hero story. This takes place as Beckham intentionally starves his large boa constrictor snake, which you see here, which he has raised since it was young. Beckham tortures the animal, yet they sleep together in the same bed. Beckham says, quote, "I'd been giving it, the snake, hints and feeding its hunter instincts. And now my being asleep had given the snake the opportunity to react to my breathing, the swelling and relaxing of my chest. There's only one thing you need to know about boa constrictors. They react to motion by tightening their grip on their prey," end quote. In other words, the snake is behaving in the way its nature as a snake dictates. It must find food to survive, and it tightens its grip on its prey in relation to movement, and that of the breathing and sleeping Beckham. Beckham has set this up. He is the creator of that reality rather than its accidental recipient. Once he is in the process of being killed by the snake, Beckham struggles to the kitchen and, quote, "Then I gripped the fruit knife and stuck it into the snake's head," end quote, which he then runs down the length of the snake's body, cutting it open and killing it. So to conclude, I think the implied author, as discernible in the text, has made Emine's narration subservient to Beckham's. It is never Emine's story, though her words take up a large portion of the novel. Because the implied author is male without perhaps a vivid enough imagination, Emine's story remains emotionally muted and lacks insight into her inner world, processes, and evolution. So politically, this novel poses the question, can we ever truly step into another's shoes? If someone is from another categorical identity, sex, sexuality, race, ethnicity, etc., can we presume to understand them? Is it correct and good that I'm in charge of writing the text portraits of political novels from Finland rather than, say, Croatia or England or Spain? Should we stick to our own categorical identities? No, of course not. But I don't, of course not, because I don't want to be stuck reading books written by white heterosexual males my entire life. And reading from different categorical identities is a way of learning. And I, as a literary scholar, I'm in it to learn. So I might be wrong, I might be naive, as perhaps I was in this talk, but I'm learning, and that's, I think, the key here. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, enough time for questions first.
Thank you both for your presentations. I have a question for Eric, a very straightforward one. Can you expand a bit more about the idea that an implied author can have a gender identity?
Yeah, I think the implied author is a construct that we create from clues in the text, right? And the clues in the text, I think, point to specifically a gendered implied author. because specifically, as I tried to show, it opens with this homoerotic situation, and then we don't know the gender has switched, and there's a lot of like hands and masculine backs and like buttocks, and like and read through that opening section, it takes on a different kind of resonance, because we are reading it linearly, and we've read one thing, and then we're reading another thing, and we don't know yet the gender of the second narrator. So yeah, I think as a construct, it can be anything. You know, we can construct, we create this kind of picture of the implied author, or it is, or should I say, it is created by the text. And I think there are clues for that. And I think a close reading would, of course, you could also show the opposite, but I found, well, interpretation is exactly that. It's like, you know, you interpret it one way, I interpret it this way, and then we give a high five and move on. But I think that there are clues for a gendered implied author, yeah. Thank you.
Can I ask my question to Eric, since I'm here and I've got the microphone? And just building on that. Well, first of all, I have to say that this sounds like an excellent novel. I haven't read it. I don't know how many of you have read it, but I remember when the English translation first came out, it was really well reviewed in various newspapers. So it's been on my radar. It sounds like a brilliant novel. And one question is, it's his debut novel, right? So it's an interesting question of how, because Assembly is also Natasha Brown's debut novel. So it's interesting how these new novelists are writing these explicitly political novels. And I think that's a question to kind of think about a little bit. The other question I had was, obviously the novel, it has this kind of doubleness to it. We have two narrators, two situations going on. It's also moving from genre to genre. So it's science fiction, it's a trauma narrative as well. So it never really, it seems to me that I haven't read it, but from what you were saying, it doesn't settle on one thing. And perhaps this reflects the refugee or migrant experience of how perhaps, you know, movement and not settling or not being certain of where one is going is, you know, a central part of that. And it's also quite interesting that the relationships that these two narrators have are abusive relationships. So that perhaps mirrors this idea that migrants, refugees end up having abusive relationships with the hosts, you know, of the host countries or the people, the locals they meet, and that it is very traumatic to go through that, but also overcome that and get to the other side. So I was just wondering if you have any comments about.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I've read a great interview with Statovci by a scholar and the translator, and in Finnish, Statovci's sentences are abnormally long and lyrical. And since Finnish doesn't have a gendered pronoun, in Finnish typically they repeat the subject, and he doesn't. And he said himself, I mean, I'm taking his words for it now, but he leaves a lot of room for interpretation. He does not explain things. And this is the first time I read the book, I was like, oh my God, this is the best book ever. Second time I read it, I was a lot more critical, opposite of what these people on the radio. I think that it can mean just about anything. He leaves so much space there. But some things he's squarely political about, like the immigrant experience in Finland and racism and what it's like to live in Finland as someone that's not from the majority culture, and that's not ambiguous at all. But then again, it's a cat who's the worst character, so it's kind of like it's just some people call it magical realism because all kinds of. But again, yeah, it jumps from genre to genre, and definitely trauma literature would be, yeah. So, but yeah, I had to keep reading it, and I think by this time next year I'll have a better opinion about what I think about it. Thank you.
Comments and questions. Okay.
Performance. How did the performance deal with the two narrators, with the body of the actor, in terms of gender identity? The performance. You're telling.
I'm
about-
really embarrassed to say I didn't see it, so I don't know. Yeah, I just started on this novel, and like there was posters for the performance everywhere in Helsinki, and I was like, oh, Yugoslavia, we're from Croatia, you know. I was like, ha ha ha. But I just started on this, so I will, yeah.
Okay, maybe we can now discuss a little bit first presentation of colleague Polina. Maybe if we talk about medical political narratives as some kind of stage for social critique or type of emancipatory genre or fiction. Maybe you could say, what would you find the most appropriate methodological approach to these texts vis-a-vis our project, perhaps?
Yeah, so my approach so far has been to look at the narratives from a health humanities perspective. So I'm looking at the ways in which they don't just speak to storytelling, but also to specific sociopolitical issues that have to do with health in particular. So I find that quite useful. You can look at these narratives in different ways, obviously. But to me, it seems that it's worth looking at them from the health perspective, principally because the world has just gone through a pandemic, so we're all interested in that, and we saw firsthand, I suppose, we'll have lived experience of what it means for to live through a pandemic, to have your health policed by governments in particular, and how quickly our freedoms can be taken away from us, and boundaries can be eroded, etc. When it comes to the gender perspective, well, I'm kind of making it easy for myself by looking at novels by women, but they do, that there is a big issue with how women are treated within the healthcare system. There are health disparities, particularly to do with women of color. And so that perspective, I think, is really, really important to look at. And these two novels that I've been looking at, again, make it quite easy because they make their political kind of points about this situation very, very clear. There's no doubt, especially in Assembly, for example, the narrator states quite clearly that the woman is put in this, the young black woman is put in this position because of her identity, and therefore she's fighting a war that is much bigger, if you like, than just the cancer that she has to kind of deal with. The scope is much bigger because of races, because of intersectional structures that she has to deal with. Does that yeah, I mean, okay.
We can, maybe that could be a question for both of you. Maybe we could discuss those novels as some kind of political in their form. Maybe we could see what they are doing with text and see what they are producing regarding empowerment, regarding engagement, or some kind of going through these problems that are dealt with.
That question is really interesting. Both of the novels that I'm looking at, in fact, resist the novel as a form. Assembly is narrated by an unnamed narrator. I'm not saying that all novels have named narrators, but the fact that it's an unnamed narrator creates certain uncertainty. Also, the narrative is quite fragmented, so it resists this kind of, this idea that it should be put in a certain kind of box. Towards the end of the book, also we have the writer goes into poetry, so we have two kind of genres to deal with at that point. The book by Roy, The Fat Lady Sings, has two narrators, like the book you were talking about, and the story is told in vignettes. One narrator is more gives us a narrative that is much more linear. This is Gloria. The second narrator, the much younger woman, her narrative is much more fragmentary. At points we're not sure about exactly what she's talking about. She's the one who's going through severe trauma, and so the narratives kind of resist this idea that that are that they can be read as kind of straightforward novels that have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and some sort of resolution at the end. And I think they do question, you know, what kind of form we might need to express this political ideas. That that form itself can be challenged in all kinds of ways, and of course, you know, that propels us to use kind of, you know, different methodologies also to approach these texts.
Yeah, well, like I said earlier, there's so many different genres, and so many things aren't so, or a lot of things aren't so explicit. So that does create this kind of what is actually being said here, and so it's a stylistic and a formal type of decision, how much information to give, and that does make the reader, at least me in my case, confused and trying to seek for meaning. And on an emotional level, though, definitely, and I guess following Polina's question from before, I'm not sure if there is if there is the immigrant experience, but yeah, I guess we could talk about that. But for this particular, our narrators, they both come to Finland, and specifically for them, it is very difficult, and maybe perhaps like getting meaning from this novel, except for some things are very clear, but generally it's a struggle.
Question on that quote, that cat is mocking on name. It's Emina's name. Emina's name.
It's Beckham's name. Beckham is the most outrageous name he's ever heard.
Okay. And what does it mean, Beckham? Do you know?
Oh, it says in the book. Because the cat, he says it means it means gift from God or something. Mm. And then the cat says, "Oh, then it's certainly the wrong name for you," or like, you know, this is so stupid, you know, because this is completely outrageous.
You asked me before about pronouncing Emine.
Yeah.
And I was searching for, not from pronunciation, but for the meaning. It's very interesting that Emine means the one who you can trust and believe. Uh-huh. So it's interesting that you have narrator who has name explicitly stating that you can trust and believe. So maybe it's interesting for a discussion about narratology of this novel.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you both very much. I was very happy listening to both texts, and I would love to talk later about Statovci very much because I'm interested in the novel. But actually, I would like to ask Polina, because what you were saying about the genre is very interesting to me. The question is, in your understanding, how far it has been formed as a subgenre, let's say, and then how is it related in any way with this proliferation of interest in medical genres of another kind? You know, there is a huge number of TV series or, you know, series which are streamlined and which are more or less political. For example, The Good Doctor as a series of an autistic doctor is so profoundly political. Some others are not. So in a sense, do you see, how do you see the position of the genre in its larger context and whose primary audience?
That's a really interesting question, because you're talking about the medical political novel as a genre, right? So in one sense, this is a very old type of writing, isn't it? So it's political narrative that focuses on medical issues, and we can go very far back, as I did in the paper. But you can also look at very recent examples of television medical shows, for example, that also occasionally go into politics as well, like House, which could have went into politics, especially towards the end of the show. So the point is, how does this particular type of narrative deal with the political questions of now, particularly in terms of health? That's what I'm asking. And what are the distinct traits of this kind of narrative? And I think the answer is that you must look at each body of work separately. So if you take novels by Black, female Black authors, then you find basically roughly what I found. A lot of the time you find the idea that the Black female body is an important figure in these narratives, the idea that health disparities affect women, Black women, more than many other groups, etc. So I wouldn't make a sweeping statement and say, oh, the medical political novel is this. But what I would say is that it has to be placed within a larger tradition of medical political narratives, which also include other genres, as I was saying, and other types of work, but with very specific characteristics depending on the body of work that you're looking at. And what I would be really interesting to look at is how that plays out in other literatures as well. We're only been looking at English language literature, because that's what I specialize in. But I just started to look at Greek literature, which is another language that I speak. And what I found there, fascinatingly, is that a lot of medical political narratives are written by working class women. So that's a big question. What drives working class women to talk about that specifically? And perhaps part of the question is that in a place like Greece, where the healthcare system is not that brilliant, and there's a lot of poverty and systemic issues, perhaps working class women are those who are particularly affected by disparities in healthcare.
Well, then just a short sub question, because what I have found and mentioned a little bit is that explicit interest in humanitarian issues is one of the characteristics of the most recent both world literature and global literature. Would you say the same then for medical political novel which is written now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say the same. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Maybe one more short question, or we can close this session. Thank for both our participants, and thank you.